Picture this. It's 1450, and if you want a book, you'd better have the patience of a monk and the wallet of a king. A single copy of the Bible took scribes about 2 years to hand copy, cost more than a house, and was filled with more errors than a drunk sailor's navigation chart. Then along comes this guy named Johannes Gutenberg, tinkering away in his workshop in Mainz, Germany, about to accidentally trigger the biggest information revolution in human history. We're talking bigger than the internet, bigger than television, bigger than smoke signals. This one workshop was about to make books cheaper than a decent meal and turn the world upside down. But here's what nobody tells you about Gutenberg's workshop. It wasn't some magical place where books appeared out of thin air. It was a grimy, smelly, dangerous factory where men worked with molten metal, toxic fumes, and machinery that could crush your fingers faster than you could say, printing press. The real story isn't just about some brilliant inventor having a light bulb moment. It's about the incredible teamwork, the backbreaking labor, and the absolutely insane attention to detail that went into every single page that rolled off those presses. Let me paint you a picture of what Europe looked like before Gutenberg changed everything. Imagine a world where knowledge moved at the speed of a limping turtle. Books were so rare and expensive that entire universities owned maybe a few dozen volumes. Most people lived their entire lives without ever seeing a book, let alone owning one. The lucky few who could read had to travel hundreds of miles just to study a single manuscript. It was like having the entire internet controlled by a handful of monasteries who charged a fortune just to look at their websites. The scribes who copied these books by hand weren't just dealing with writer's cramp. They were fighting a losing battle against time and human error. Every single letter had to be perfect, every word carefully formed, and every page meticulously checked. But here's the kicker. Even the most careful scribe made mistakes. By the time a book had been copied 10 times, it barely resembled the original. It was like playing telephone, except instead of a silly message getting garbled, you were dealing with medical texts, legal documents, and religious scriptures that people's lives depended on. Then came the shockwave. Gutenberg's workshop could produce more pages in a single day than a scribe could copy in months. We're talking about going from maybe 2 books per year to hundreds of identical copies in the same time frame. The price of books didn't just drop, it crashed through the floor like a cannonball through a paper sail. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't locked away in castle libraries and monastery vaults. It was flooding the streets, spreading faster than gossip in a small town. Walking into Gutenberg's workshop was like stepping into a perfectly orchestrated chaos. This wasn't your quiet library or peaceful scriptorium. The air was thick with smoke from the furnaces, the sharp smell of metal, and the constant sound of hammering, grinding, and the rhythmic thump of the press. Every corner of this room had a specific purpose, and every person had a job that required years of training to master. The first thing that would hit you was the heat coming from the type foundry corner. This was where the magic began, though it looked more like a medieval blacksmith shop than a place of learning. Furnaces glowed red hot, melting down a carefully guarded mixture of lead, tin, and antimony into the liquid metal that would become individual letters. The smell alone was enough to make your eyes water. Imagine melting down old fishing weights while someone burns rubber nearby. Next to the foundry, you'd see rows upon rows of type cases, wooden boxes divided into compartments like a massive spice rack. But instead of herbs and seasonings, these held thousands of tiny metal letters, each one perfectly crafted and sorted by size and style. The upper case held capital letters, which is actually where we get the term uppercase from. The lower case held the small letters, numbers, and punctuation marks. It was like looking at the alphabet's filing system, except each letter was a tiny work of art made from molten metal. The compositor's bench was where the real artistry happened. This was where skilled craftsmen took those individual letters and turned them into readable text. It required the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous. One wrong letter, one misplaced space, and you'd have to start the entire line over again. The compositor had to think backwards too. Remember, everything had to be set in reverse so it would print correctly. Over at the inking station, workers prepared the thick, oil-based ink that would soon coat the metal type. This wasn't like the watery ink scribes used. This stuff was closer to paint, specially formulated to stick to metal and transfer cleanly to paper. Getting the consistency just right was an art form. Too thin, and the text would look faded and weak. Too thick, and you'd end up with blotchy, unreadable mess. But the star of the show was the printing press itself. A massive contraption that looked like a wine press had gotten into a fight with a medieval torture device. This beast could exert enough pressure to squeeze water from a stone, and it needed every ounce of that force to push ink from metal type onto paper. The whole thing was built like a tank, with wooden beams thick enough to support a small building. The process of making type was where Gutenberg's genius really showed. He didn't just figure out how to print books. He invented an entirely new way to manufacture the alphabet. The secret was in the alloy, a precise mixture of lead, tin, and antimony that had to be heated to exactly the right temperature. Too hot, and the metal would be too soft. Too cool, and it wouldn't flow properly into the molds. The hand mold itself was a marvel of medieval engineering. It was basically a hinged box that could create perfect, identical letters hundreds of times over. The typecaster would pour molten metal into the mold, wait for it to cool, then pop out a brand new letter. But here's the tricky part. Every single letter had to be exactly the same height, or the printing would look like a drunken sailor had set the type. After casting, each letter needed trimming and finishing. Workers would file off excess metal, check for flaws, and make sure every character was perfect. Then came the sorting. Thousands of tiny metal letters had to be organized into those type cases we mentioned earlier. It was like doing inventory at the world's smallest hardware store. Except if you mixed up the letters, entire books would be ruined. The compositor's job was where patience met artistry. Using a composing stick, basically a metal ruler with adjustable sides, they would set type letter by letter, word by word, line by line. Each line had to be exactly the right length to fit the page, which meant adding spaces and adjusting letter spacing until everything lined up perfectly. It was like doing a crossword puzzle where every answer had to fit precisely, and one mistake could ruin hours of work. But even the most careful compositor made mistakes. Letters would get mixed up, spaces would be uneven, and occasionally an entire line would be set upside down. These errors had to be caught and corrected before printing, which meant even more time and careful checking. The whole process required a level of attention to detail that would drive most people absolutely crazy. This intricate dance of metalworking, precision crafting, and careful composition was just the beginning of what made Gutenberg's workshop revolutionary. Every single step had to be perfect, because once you started printing hundreds of copies, any mistake would be multiplied hundreds of times over. The ink itself was where Gutenberg made one of his most crucial innovations, though it probably seemed like the least exciting part to anyone watching. Scribes had been using water-based inks for centuries, the same stuff you'd dip a quill pen into. But try putting that watery ink on metal type, and you'd get about as much transfer as trying to paint a wall with soup. Gutenberg figured out that oil-based ink was the secret sauce, literally mixing linseed oil with soot and other pigments until he got something thick enough to coat metal type, but smooth enough to transfer cleanly to paper. Making this ink was like cooking a really expensive, really smelly stew. Workers would grind pigments by hand for hours, slowly adding oil until the mixture reached the perfect consistency. Too runny, and it would drip off the type before it hit the paper. Too thick, and it would gum up the works like peanut butter in a keyhole. The smell was something else entirely. Imagine burning oil mixed with charcoal dust and whatever mysterious ingredients they threw in to make it stick better. It was the kind of aroma that would follow you home and make your spouse ask what dead animal you'd been rolling around with. But ink was only half the equation. The paper itself required its own special treatment. Unlike the scribes who could work with dry parchment or vellum, printing required paper that had been dampened to just the right moisture level. Dry paper wouldn't accept the ink properly, but soggy paper would tear under the massive pressure of the press. Workers would dampen sheets the night before printing, keeping them between wet cloths like the world's most boring sandwich. Getting the moisture level perfect was like trying to cook pasta. There was a tiny window between not ready and completely ruined. The paper versus vellum debate was basically about money versus quality. Vellum, made from animal skins, was gorgeous and lasted forever, but it cost more than most people made in a year. Paper was cheaper but trickier to work with. Some of Gutenberg's fanciest books were printed on vellum for wealthy customers, while regular folks got the paper versions. It was like offering both leather and cloth car seats. Same book, different price points. The printing press itself was an adapted wine press, which makes perfect sense when you think about it. Wine presses were designed to squeeze liquid out of grapes using massive amounts of pressure. Gutenberg basically said, what if instead of grapes, we squeezed ink out of metal letters onto paper? The engineering was brilliant in its simplicity. A heavy wooden screw mechanism could generate enormous downward force, pressing the paper against the inked type with enough pressure to transfer every detail. The platen was the business end of the press, a flat metal plate that came down like a giant stamp. But between the platen and the paper was a whole system of protection called the tympan and frisket. The tympan was basically a padded frame covered with parchment that helped distribute the pressure evenly. The frisket was a paper mask with holes cut out to match the text area, protecting the margins from stray ink blots. It was like having a stencil and padding all built into one system. Setting up for each impression required what they called make ready, adjusting everything so the pressure was perfectly even across the entire page. This wasn't just slapping paper down and pulling a lever. Every sheet of paper was slightly different. Every page of type had its own quirks, and the pressman had to account for all of it. One corner printing too light. Add some padding. Another area printing too dark. Adjust the pressure. It was like tuning a musical instrument, except instead of sound, you were tuning ink transfer. The actual printing process was a carefully choreographed dance between two workers. The first person would ink the type using leather balls stuffed with wool, rolling the ink across the metal letters like spreading butter on toast. Too much ink, and you'd get smudges. Too little, and the text would look faded. Meanwhile, the second person positioned the dampened paper on the tympan, making sure it was perfectly aligned. One crooked sheet, and you'd have text running uphill across the page. Then came the moment of truth, pulling the press. The pressman would grab the handle and pull it across, engaging the screw mechanism that brought the platen down with tremendous force. You could hear the press groan under the pressure, wood creaking and metal straining as tons of force compressed type against paper. The whole building probably shook with each pull. After a few seconds, they'd reverse the process, lifting the platen and revealing the freshly printed page. The throughput was impressive for the time, but would seem glacially slow today. A good crew could produce maybe 200 to 300 impressions per day. And remember, each sheet had to be printed twice, once for each side. That means a single book page actually required 2 separate trips through the press. Compare that to modern printing, where thousands of pages zip through machines every hour, and you start to appreciate just how labor-intensive Gutenberg's process really was. But speed wasn't the only challenge. Every single impression had to be checked for quality. Smudged letters, uneven ink coverage, crooked text. Any of these problems meant starting over. The pressman developed eagle eyes for spotting defects, because catching a problem after printing 100 copies was a disaster that could bankrupt the workshop. It was like being a quality control inspector for the alphabet, except instead of rejecting widgets, you were rejecting pages that represented hours of careful work. The proofing process was where the workshop's corrector earned his keep. This guy had to read every single page, checking not just for printing defects, but for errors in the original typesetting. A missing letter, a wrong word, a line set backwards. All of these had to be caught and fixed before the final printing run. The corrector was basically the workshop's editor, proofreader, and quality control manager all rolled into one. When errors were found, fixing them was like performing surgery on a metal patient. The compositor would have to dig through the form, find the incorrect letter, and replace it with the right one. Sounds simple enough, until you realize that pulling out one letter could disturb the spacing of an entire line. Sometimes they'd have to reset half a page just to fix a single wrong character. It was like pulling one card from a house of cards and hoping the whole thing didn't collapse. The drying racks were another crucial piece of the puzzle that most people never think about. Fresh ink took hours to dry completely, and you couldn't just stack wet pages on top of each other unless you wanted to create the world's most expensive sandwich. The workshop had elaborate systems of wooden racks where pages would hang like laundry, dripping excess ink and slowly drying in the smoky air. Walking through the drying area was like navigating a paper maze with sheets hanging everywhere at eye level. Once the pages were finally dry, the real fun began, turning loose sheets into actual books. This process, called gathering, required workers to collect the printed sheets in the correct order and fold them into signatures. Getting the page order wrong was like shuffling a deck of cards and trying to play poker. Technically, you still had all the pieces, but they weren't doing you much good. A single mistake in gathering could result in books where Chapter 5 came before Chapter 2, which tended to confuse readers considerably. The binding process was where craftsmanship met durability. Simple pamphlets got basic stitching, but proper books required wooden boards, covered with leather, brass clasps, and sometimes even metal studs for protection. Some of the fancier volumes got hand-painted decorations called rubrication, those ornate red letters and elaborate borders you see in medieval manuscripts. It was like adding racing stripes to your car, except instead of making it go faster, it made your book cost 3 times as much. But creating beautiful books was pointless if you didn't have the right people to make it happen. The workshop operated like a small army, each person with specialized skills that took years to master. At the bottom of the hierarchy was the typecaster, whose job was equal parts metallurgy and artistry. These guys worked with molten metal all day, breathing fumes that probably took years off their lives, all while creating thousands of identical letters that had to be perfect down to the tiniest detail. The compositor was the workshop's wordsmith, someone who could read backwards, think in reverse, and spot a wrong letter from across the room. They developed a kind of muscle memory for where each letter lived in the type cases, grabbing characters without even looking. Watch a skilled compositor work, and it was like seeing someone play piano. Their hands would dance across the cases, pulling letters and building words faster than most people could read. The pressman was part athlete, part engineer. Running the press required serious physical strength. Pulling that handle hundreds of times a day would give anyone arms like a blacksmith. But it also required finesse, knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, when to adjust the setup, and how to spot problems before they ruined an entire print run. A good pressman could feel when something was off just from the resistance of the handle. Training for these jobs was brutal by modern standards. New workers started as apprentices, spending years learning the trade while earning barely enough to survive. They'd sweep floors, organize type cases, and gradually work their way up to handling the actual production. The learning curve was steep, and mistakes were expensive. Drop a former full of set type, and you just destroyed hours of careful work. Mix up the letters in the type cases, and you'd slow down the entire workshop for days. The pay wasn't exactly generous either. Most workers earned just enough to keep body and soul together, with the skilled craftsman making maybe twice what a common labourer could earn. But the job came with serious occupational hazards. Lead fumes from the typecasting gave workers what they called the printer's palsy, tremors and weakness that came from years of metal poisoning. Fingers got crushed in the press mechanism with depressing regularity. The combination of heavy machinery, molten metal, and toxic fumes made Gutenberg's workshop about as safe as a medieval construction site. Shop discipline was strict because it had to be. One careless worker could destroy days of careful preparation. Gutenberg ran his workshop like a military operation, with clear rules about everything from how to handle the type to when workers could take breaks. Breaking the rules didn't just mean getting fired. In some cases, it meant being sued for the cost of ruined materials. The whole operation was financed by Johann Fust, Gutenberg's business partner and eventual nemesis. Fust put up the money for equipment, materials and worker wages, expecting to see profits once books started selling. But printing was expensive, slow, and risky. Every book was a gamble. Would people actually buy enough copies to cover the enormous upfront costs? The famous lawsuit between Gutenberg and Fust was basically a medieval version of a startup founder getting kicked out of his own company. Security was another constant worry. The techniques Gutenberg developed were trade secrets worth more than gold. Rival workshops would have loved to steal the methods for making type, mixing ink, or operating the press. Workers had to sign agreements promising not to reveal workshop secrets. And unauthorized visitors were about as welcome as tax collectors at a pirate convention. The early products coming out of the workshop tell the story of a business trying to find its market. Indulgences were basically get-out-of-hell free cards that the Catholic Church sold to raise money. They were perfect for printing, standard text, high volume, decent profit margins. Pamphlets and broadsides were the newspapers of their day, spreading news, gossip, and political propaganda faster than ever before. But the masterpiece was the 42-line Bible, probably the most famous book ever printed. Each page had exactly 42 lines of text in 2 columns, with lettering so perfect it looked like the work of the finest scribes. The quality was so high that some people initially thought they were hand-copied manuscripts. It took nearly 3 years to complete, used about 3,100 animal skins worth of vellum for the deluxe copies, and probably cost more than most small towns were worth. The impact hit Europe like a tsunami of paper and ink. Book prices didn't just drop, they crashed through the floor and kept falling. A Bible that once cost as much as a house could suddenly be bought for the price of a good cow. Universities could afford entire libraries instead of just a handful of precious volumes. Ideas that had been locked away in monastery scriptoriums suddenly spread across continents faster than plague. The literacy rate started climbing as books became affordable. When knowledge costs a fortune, only the wealthy bother learning to read. But when books become cheap, suddenly everyone wants in on the action. It was like the difference between owning a computer when they cost $50,000 versus when they cost $500. The whole game changes. The Reformation probably wouldn't have happened without Gutenberg's press. When Martin Luther nailed his complaints to that church door, printed copies spread across Germany in weeks instead of years. The Catholic Church suddenly found itself fighting not just one rebellious monk, but thousands of identical pamphlets that kept multiplying faster than they could burn them. It was the world's first viral content, except instead of cat videos, it was religious revolution. Scientific knowledge exploded in the same way. Discoveries that once took decades to spread could now be shared across Europe in months. Scientists could build on each other's work instead of accidentally rediscovering the same things over and over. It was like switching from sending messages by carrier pigeon to having email. The speed of progress accelerated beyond anything anyone had imagined. But let's clear up some myths while we're at it. Gutenberg didn't invent printing. The Chinese had been doing it for centuries. He didn't even invent movable type. That was also a Chinese innovation. What Gutenberg did was figure out how to make it work with European languages, materials, and markets. He took existing ideas and engineered them into something that could transform an entire continent. The real genius wasn't in having one brilliant idea. It was in solving hundreds of smaller problems that nobody talks about. How do you make metal type that's perfectly uniform? How do you create ink that sticks to metal but transfers cleanly to paper? How do you build a press that can apply tons of pressure hundreds of times a day without breaking? How do you organize a workshop to produce identical books efficiently and profitably? Gutenberg's workshop wasn't just the birthplace of printing, it was the prototype for mass production, quality control, and industrial organization. The techniques developed in that smoky room in Mainz would eventually reshape everything from manufacturing to communication to education. Not bad for a guy who was probably just trying to make a living selling books. The printing press didn't just change what people read, it changed how they thought. When knowledge becomes cheap and widely available, the whole structure of society starts shifting. Authority that once came from controlling information suddenly faces challenges from every direction. Ideas that were once safely locked away in elite circles escape into the general population, where they multiply, evolve, and sometimes explode into revolution. That grimy, dangerous, revolutionary workshop in Mainz didn't just print books, it printed the future. And the world has never been the same since.